My name is Melissa Grant. I'm 32 years old, and at my father's funeral, I watched my own sister step forward and announce without hesitation that she would inherit the company and $800 million. She didn't frame it as an assumption or a possibility. She stated it like a conclusion everyone else had somehow missed, like the room was simply late to accept what she already believed was inevitable. The memorial was held that afternoon inside a private arts center in Pasadena, carefully chosen for privacy and for the people it could contain: board members, investors, longtime partners, the kind of audience that listens for what comes next, even while pretending to grieve. When my sister took the microphone, no one stopped her. No one questioned the timing, and no one seemed surprised when she spoke about continuity leadership and how everything had already been arranged. Heads nodded, expressions settled. The future appeared to fall neatly into place. Then she said it clearly that the company was hers, that the inheritance was secured, that the direction had already been decided. And just as she finished, a sound cut through the room. It wasn't loud and it wasn't dramatic, just a short, unmistakable chuckle coming through the speaker system near my father's casket. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped. People looked toward the sound booth, then at each other, trying to decide whether they'd imagined it. I didn't move, because I knew it wasn't a technical error and it wasn't an accident. That sound meant something had been activated, something that had been waiting for the exact moment my sister claimed what she thought belonged to her. Standing there, watching confidence turn into uncertainty, I understood what she didn't. The inheritance she had just announced was already gone. Before I explain how my father made sure the truth surfaced and why my sister's certainty unraveled in front of everyone who mattered, take a moment to subscribe if you're drawn to stories where power isn't handed down but tested in real time, because this wasn't a family disagreement, it was a reckoning that had been set in motion long before that afternoon ever began. After the last traces of applause dissolved and the audience subtly shifted in their seats, the memorial did not stop, it quietly transformed. The room remained formal and controlled, but its emotional center slid away from remembrance and toward calculation, and that was when Heather Grant stopped behaving like a grieving daughter and began moving like someone taking possession. She did not stay near the casket or follow the program's rhythm. Instead, she stepped directly into the crowd, approaching board members, first greeting them with practiced familiarity, her voice calm, efficient, and unmistakably professional. She spoke about continuity as if it were urgent, about stability as if it were fragile, and about how uncertainty had a way of unsettling confidence, framing each statement as though decisive leadership were not an option, but a responsibility she had already assumed. No one interrupted her, and no one reminded her that this was not a briefing or a negotiation. What unsettled the room was not her ambition, but how casually she began reshaping the event around herself. Without drawing attention, she leaned toward the event staff and requested that the portion honoring longtime employees be shortened, explaining that schedules were tight and guests had limited time. Moments later, she noticed the digital program rotating tributes and asked for a small adjustment so her remarks would remain visible longer than planned, justifying it as clarity rather than prominence. Each request was minor, framed as practical, but together they redirected focus away from the man being honored and toward the person positioning herself to replace him. Conversations nearby slowed, eyes shifted, and people began watching her movements instead of the stage. The memorial was no longer centered on reflection, it was being reorganized in real time. I stayed where I was and watched, without intervening. Stopping her would have turned the moment into a confrontation, and that would have given her a legitimacy she had not earned. Heather was not being careless. She was being deliberate, testing how much space she could take without resistance. She moved with the assurance of someone who believed opposition would be inconvenient rather than necessary. When she reached Aaron McLeod, her tone sharpened further, direct and transactional. She issued a brief instruction about tightening the schedule and limiting access to certain areas, phrasing it as a procedural adjustment rather than a request. Aaron listened without challenging her, and without agreeing. His response measured his expression neutral. He did not nod, did not move, and did not signal compliance, and the absence of confirmation lingered longer than her words. Around us, the memorial continued, but it no longer felt grounded. People who had arrived to honor a legacy were now quietly reassessing the dynamics unfolding in front of them. Heather kept circulating, confident, efficient, increasingly detached from the purpose of the gathering. She smiled when it served her dismissed concerns with practiced ease, and spoke only about what came next, never once turning back toward the casket as she outlined a future she assumed was already hers. There was no single moment dramatic enough to demand intervention, no outburst that crossed an obvious line, only a steady accumulation of choices that revealed exactly how she viewed the situation and her entitlement within it. I did not stop her, and I did not signal to Aaron. I let the room absorb the shift as it happened, because entitlement exposes itself most clearly when it is allowed to continue uninterrupted. By the time the program attempted to return to its intended rhythm, the imbalance was already set. The memorial no longer belonged fully to the past, and it had not yet arrived at the future either. It hovered in a tense middle space shaped by assumptions left unchallenged and by a confidence that had begun to feel premature, and even without fully understanding why, everyone present could sense that something fundamental had slipped out of alignment. As the movement in the room continued without me, I stepped back toward the outer edge of the space and let myself disappear from the center of attention, and standing there, in that narrow margin between people and silence, my thoughts drifted to the years when the company functioned far away from stages, microphones, and assumptions. There was a night when a regional operations failure threatened to derail a long-term contract that had taken months to secure, not because anything exploded or collapsed outright, but because a chain of small delays compounded into something that would have given the client a clean exit if it reached morning unresolved. No alerts went out. No senior executives were summoned, and no one framed it as a crisis. But I saw the pattern early enough to trace it backward through disconnected systems, reallocate resources that were technically unavailable, and close the gaps before the failure became visible. By the time anyone with authority was aware there had been a risk at all, the client had already confirmed their satisfaction, and the issue was filed away as routine variance. Later, during an internal review that was supposed to be procedural, I noticed a compliance misclassification buried deep in reporting thresholds that had gone unquestioned for years, the kind that doesn't trigger immediate penalties but quietly accumulates exposure until it attracts attention no one can control. Fixing it meant rebuilding a framework that touched multiple departments, correcting historical filings without drawing scrutiny, and doing it carefully enough that the solution didn't create new questions. The audit passed cleanly, the risk dissolved, and the work disappeared without acknowledgement because it had never been visible to begin with. The most fragile situation came when a strategic agreement was signed quickly to preserve momentum, celebrated for its optics and reach, while its downstream obligations remained largely unexamined. I recognized the imbalance immediately, not because the deal was reckless, but because it assumed conditions that didn't exist once execution began. I renegotiated terms, quietly adjusted deliverables before activation, and corrected the exposure before the agreement ever moved beyond paper. The partnership held the error never surfaced, and the narrative remained intact because the problem had been neutralized before it could be named. None of these moments earned recognition, and none of them were meant to. They existed entirely outside applause status or visibility, bound instead to repetition, vigilance, and consequence. Standing at the edge of the memorial, watching confidence circulate through the room, I understood how different that kind of knowledge was from what most people saw. One side of leadership spoke fluently about direction and ownership, while the other understood precisely where systems broke under pressure and how little margin actually existed. Heather knew how to present the company, how to speak about it, how to claim it as an idea. I knew how close it came to failing when assumptions went untested and decisions moved faster than understanding. The difference wasn't intelligence or ambition, it was proximity. I had lived inside the machinery long enough to recognize stress before it showed cracks, and because of that, I understood something no announcement could convey. Stability doesn't announce itself. It survives quietly, maintained by people who don't need credit to know when something has been saved. Several days before the memorial, the headquarters felt settled on the surface, but misaligned underneath, and the shift became obvious the moment Heather Grant walked into the executive floor without waiting for acknowledgement. She spoke less like a successor and more like someone correcting inefficiencies, moving quickly through conversations, redirecting attention, and treating long-standing processes as temporary obstacles rather than safeguards. When she convened a closed meeting, the framing was subtle but firm, positioning it as a necessary adjustment to keep things moving while emotions were still raw. The directive itself was delivered without hesitation, a proposal to reroute funds internally and bypass a layer of oversight that existed specifically to slow decisions that carried long-term exposure. It wasn't presented as a risk, only as a practical shortcut justified by urgency, the kind that sounds reasonable until it's examined closely. Erin McLeod responded with restraint, not challenging her authority outright, but outlining consequences in careful terms, explaining that removing those controls would leave a permanent record and that even temporary exceptions tend to become permanent liabilities. Heather listened without pushing back, then dismissed the concern with a controlled confidence, reframing caution as resistance, and insisting that delay would signal weakness at a moment when perception mattered more than procedure. I didn't interrupt, not because the implications weren't clear, but because the dynamic in the room had already shifted beyond debate. This was no longer about evaluating options. It was about establishing dominance, and Heather was testing whether anyone would stop her. The document was placed in front of her cleanly, its language precise, its consequences buried beneath formal phrasing that assumed competence rather than scrutiny. She skimmed it quickly, her impatience visible, and signed without requesting clarification. Watching her do it, I understood exactly what had happened. There were only two paths available at that moment, neither of them neutral. One required intervening, forcing a pause, absorbing the immediate fallout, and preserving surface stability by preventing the decision from taking effect, a choice that would have protected the organization in the short term while leaving the underlying pattern intact. The other required stepping back entirely, allowing the action to proceed, ensuring that the system documented the choice without interference, and accepting that the consequences would be irreversible. I chose silence, not as avoidance, but as resolution. Heather believed she was asserting control, unaware that by bypassing safeguards and committing her authority to paper, she was anchoring responsibility in a way that could not be undone by explanation or intent. Aaron did not speak again, his restraint deliberate, his role clear. The meeting concluded without confrontation, without raised voices, without acknowledgement of what had just been set in motion. Operations resumed, emails continued to flow, and the company appeared stable to anyone not looking closely. But the decision had already separated appearance from reality. Heather walked away believing she had secured her position through decisiveness, while I understood that she had eliminated the only margin that would have allowed her to recover. From that moment forward, there was no option to quietly correct course, no room for reinterpretation, and no path back to plausible deniability. The choice had been made, not spoken aloud, not challenged, simply allowed to stand, and that silence ensured it would speak for itself when the time came. When the room finally quieted again, the screen activated without announcement, and the recorded image of Donald Grant appeared seated behind a plain desk not framed for sentiment, but for instruction. He did not acknowledge the memorial, the audience, or his absence. He spoke as if addressing an internal review, his tone measured, controlled, and devoid of emotional appeal. He stated that wealth is not an achievement but a responsibility that magnifies the consequences of poor judgment, and that anyone granted access to it becomes accountable not for intention but for outcome. As he spoke, structured data appeared beside him: authorization logs, approval hierarchies, compliance checkpoints, each aligned precisely with his words. He explained that authority does not come from position but from restraint, and that the earliest sign of abuse is the belief that oversight exists to slow other people down. A sequence of records followed showing internal controls, bypassed reviews, shortened exceptions justified under urgency, not presented as accusations, only as facts preserved exactly as they occurred. Donald continued without emphasis, stating that shortcuts do not disappear simply because they are framed as temporary, and that systems do not forget even when people hope they will. The data advanced methodically, showing patterns of behavior rather than isolated decisions, and the room began to register the alignment between his words and the evidence accumulating on the screen. Heather's composure shifted almost imperceptibly, at first a tightening in her expression, her posture stiffening as she followed the progression unfolding in front of everyone. Donald did not name her or reference family. He spoke instead about stewardship, explaining that those entrusted with control are measured not by confidence, but by what they choose to ignore when no one is watching. Another layer of documentation appeared: internal acknowledgments, signed procedural confirmations, records of access granted, and limits exceeded, each reinforcing the same conclusion without commentary. Heather's breathing became uneven, her attention darting between the screen and the audience, as the realization settled that this was not a warning or a lesson delivered too late. Donald stated that trust without verification is not loyalty, it is negligence, and that systems are designed to protect organizations from individuals who mistake decisiveness for entitlement. The screen displayed archived correspondence, neutral in tone, unambiguous in content, establishing a timeline that could not be reframed or softened. Heather shifted in her seat, her restraint eroding, as the room absorbed what was being presented not as an emotional revelation, but as an operational record. Donald concluded by stating that consequences are not punishments imposed after the fact, but outcomes already embedded in the structure when rules are disregarded. He explained that alignment occurs when actions finally meet the systems built to contain them, and that no amount of confidence can override a process designed to record reality. He ended the recording without farewell, without personal reflection, and without appeal. The screen went dark, the lights returned, and the silence that followed carried weight rather than confusion. Heather looked around the room, her authority visibly slipping as it became clear that none of this had been spontaneous or reactive. Donald had observed patterns long before they demanded attention, documented them patiently, and ensured that when the moment arrived, the truth would surface without intervention. What the audience understood then was not simply that he had anticipated misuse, but that he had engineered accountability to function even in his absence. When the silence settled after the recording, Rose Whitman stepped forward with a composure that immediately changed the temperature of the room. She did not wait for attention, and she did not ask for it. Her presence carried authority without display, the kind that exists because it has already been written into place. She explained succinctly and without emphasis that the family trust governing the company had never been symbolic. It was operational, designed to activate automatically when specific conditions were met. Control was not transferred by declarations or proximity, but by compliance with clearly defined boundaries, and those boundaries had been crossed. She did not argue intent or interpretation. The trust required neither explanation nor approval. It responded only to verified actions logged within the system. As she spoke, the structure behind her words became unmistakable. This was not a judgment being formed in real time, it was an execution already in motion. Aaron McLeod acted immediately, not looking up, not pausing, and not acknowledging the tension building behind him. Access rights were revoked in a precise sequence, credentials, invalidated permissions reassigned, and interim authority confirmed, according to a protocol that had been prepared long before the memorial was ever scheduled. Each step was clean, procedural, and irreversible. Heather stood motionless, her attention shifting from Rose to Aaron, as if waiting for an opening that never appeared. The realization arrived gradually, then all at once. There was nothing here to contest, no vote to influence, no discretion left to appeal to. Rose finished her explanation by stating that the trust existed to protect continuity. By removing choice at the moment, choice became dangerous. Her tone did not sharpen. It did not need to. She stepped back. Her role concluded, and the absence of confrontation made the outcome feel heavier than any argument could have. Heather attempted to speak, then stopped, recognizing the futility before the words left her mouth. The authority she believed she held was not being taken from her, it was being revealed as something she had never possessed. Aaron confirmed the operational changes aloud, not as an announcement, but as a formal acknowledgement entered into record, ensuring there would be no ambiguity about when control shifted. The effect was immediate. Systems remained live, communications continued uninterrupted, and the organization absorbed the transition without disruption. Heather's posture changed as comprehension settled in, her earlier certainty unraveling, as she understood that every decisive action she had taken days earlier had already been accounted for, catalogued, and tied to consequences she could not interrupt. There was no dramatic removal and no visible enforcement, only the quiet finality of a system doing exactly what it had been built to do. The audience did not need an explanation. The connection formed naturally. What once appeared to be hesitation now read as preparation. What had looked like silence revealed itself as restraint. The choice not to intervene earlier had not been weakness or indecision, it had been alignment with a structure designed to act without emotion or delay. Heather looked around the room, searching for leverage, and found none, because leverage had never resided in confidence or proximity. It belonged to the framework she had violated. Rose remained still, Aaron continued executing the protocol, and the company moved forward without acknowledging the disruption it had just absorbed. In that moment, the sequence completed itself. The decision made earlier, the one signed without scrutiny, finally met the system designed to record reality. Cause aligned with effect. Action met consequence. And Heather understood too late to matter that everything she thought she was securing had already been decided the instant she crossed a line the trust existed to defend. In the brief space that followed enforcement, Heather reached for the last language still available to her and softened everything else. She spoke about family as if blood could rewrite records, about shared responsibility, as if accountability could be diluted by proximity, and about continuity, as though it required her presence to exist. Her tone shifted from command to appeal, and she searched the board for recognition, holding eye contact, letting silence work in her favor, suggesting without saying it outright that this could still be paused if enough people felt uncomfortable letting it end this way. For a moment, it seemed possible. Not because anyone agreed with her, but because finality makes people hesitate, and hesitation looks like opportunity when someone knows how to read it. A few faces tightened, not in support, but in reluctance, the quiet impulse to avoid being the last person to close a door. Heather sensed it and leaned into that narrow opening, reframing what had happened as procedural excess, implying that the structure had acted faster than intention, and that space still existed to reconcile process with family. The room hovered there, balanced between resolution and reconsideration, until I stepped forward. I did not contradict her language or dismantle her appeal. I stated evenly that the trust's activation did not depend on emotion, timing, or consensus, and that its final condition was never her signature alone. I explained that my responsibility had been to complete the verification step required to move the trust from conditional to active, ensuring the documentation matched execution thresholds were crossed precisely, and confirmation was delivered independently exactly as designed. I did not frame it as intervention or opposition. I described it as completion. The shift in the room was immediate. The uncertainty Heather had been drawing from evaporated as the distinction became clear. There was nothing left to reconsider because the sequence had already resolved itself. Heather's expression tightened, then steadied as she attempted to reposition the moment as one of interpretation, but interpretation no longer applied. I clarified that once activation was complete, reversal was structurally impossible, not because discretion was denied, but because discretion had been deliberately removed at that stage. The trust existed to prevent negotiation after the fact, and that design was not accidental. Heather looked again to the board, searching for a counterweight, but the hesitation she had mistaken for openness had transformed into recognition. The system had not acted impulsively. It had responded exactly when it was supposed to. Heather tried once more to invoke stability, but stability had already been preserved. She tried to invoke continuity, but continuity was already in effect. What she was asking for now was interruption, and interruption was no longer available. I finished by stating that my role concluded at verification, that no further steps remained, and that the outcome would proceed without modification. The words landed without force because force was unnecessary. Heather's posture changed as the last possibility closed not abruptly, but decisively, and the false hope she had been sustaining collapsed under its own weight. The board remained silent, not out of indifference but because there was nothing left to say. The door did not slam and it did not creak. It closed cleanly without sound, leaving no edge to argue against and no handle to reach for. What remained in the room was not satisfaction or cruelty but clarity, the recognition that restraint had not been weakness and silence had not been hesitation. The sequence had been completed exactly as designed, and the moment Heather believed she could still influence had never truly existed. The audience completed the connection without instruction. What felt moments earlier like choice now read as inevitability. The final piece had been placed and the structure held. When the memorial formally concluded, the room emptied with quiet efficiency, conversations compressing into logistic schedules, reasserting themselves, and the event dissolving back into business reality. Heather waited until most people had moved on before approaching me, choosing timing carefully, not out of emotion, but calculation. She asked to speak privately. Her voice controlled her posture, restrained as if a final clarification could still alter the trajectory if handled discreetly enough. I declined without explanation and without pause, not because I wanted distance, but because distance already existed. Any conversation would have implied that a bridge remained. It did not. The consequences unfolded without announcement. Her operational role was removed through formal process reflected quietly in updated governance records and access registries that no longer carried her authorization. Compliance teams initiated civil review based on documentation already preserved. External counsel was notified, and internal reporting moved forward without urgency or hesitation. No one argued the severity. The record required no interpretation. The inquiry that followed was procedural, focused on exposure and breach of duty rather than motivation, and it progressed the way these things do in reality, methodically and without spectacle. Within a short span of time, Heather's professional access narrowed, affiliations dissolved, invitations stopped arriving, and communication channels went silent. The industry does not punish loudly, it isolates risk. Once documentation exists, networks respond automatically, not out of judgment but self-preservation. Heather attempted to re-establish contact through intermediaries suggesting conversation, floating reconciliation, implying that shared history might still matter if approached carefully. None of it reached me. There was nothing left to negotiate because nothing had been taken impulsively. The process had completed itself exactly as designed. I left the building without marking the moment, passing through familiar corridors, without hesitation, without waiting for acknowledgement, and without looking back. There was no sense of victory attached to it, no relief, and no satisfaction to claim. The outcome did not require celebration, it required acceptance. Heather remained behind, no longer attempting persuasion, only standing still, as the realization set in that the separation unfolding now would not be softened by time or explanation. I did not turn around. There was no purpose in doing so. The division was already final. What followed was continuity. Leadership stabilized, operations continued, and the organization absorbed the correction without disruption. Heather's absence registered not as a loss but as an adjustment, a variable removed so the system could function as intended. That was the clearest measure of consequence, not confrontation, not apology, not public collapse, simply removal from relevance. I did not explain my role to anyone, and I did not justify the outcome. It did not require defense. The sequence had resolved itself through structure, not sentiment. A boundary had been crossed, the response had activated, and the result had taken hold without appeal. I walked away knowing that nothing remained unfinished between us because nothing had ended abruptly. The conclusion had been approaching long before it arrived. It was not loud and it was not generous. It was exact. A quiet, final resolution that left no space for reconciliation and no reason to return. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.